seismic mitigation. Member Buchanan is literally on her way, so we are going to, as a courtesy, wait until she arrives to officially convene the meeting. But is our practice, we will allow staff to present the item, and then we will hear from stakeholders in the audience on comments, recommendations, endorsements, concerns, and dare I say opposition to aspects of what we will be talking about. Seismic Mitigation Program. And with me is Kathleen Moore. We create, by virtue of our attendance, a quorum of the subcommittee. I am assured that Assembly Member Buchanan is on her way, but she did have a robust briefing on the item, so I feel safe in beginning it because she'll be here by the time I'm sure we have our public comment. As you know, we're here to talk about changing a program that was enacted by the voters. Voters created the ability for us to set up to 10% of the dollars in Proposition 1D aside for seismic mitigation. And the board did that. The admonishment in the statute was that we had to attack the most vulnerable facilities first. And our criteria at the outset was intended to do that. We've mitigated and changed the regulations one earlier time, and we're constituted today to talk a little bit about what changes may be appropriate in today's environment. At our last committee meeting, staff was directed to create an option, which they have done, to have as a potential action, a recommendation from this body to the full board, a plan that would create a subset of facility hardship program. And the policy discussion we would have to have is whether that remains and the integrity of it remains as seismic or whether it gets folded into the facility hardship program generically. Staff was also directed to bring back a little more robust discussion about direction they received some time ago on whether or not the regulations should be altered to include the possibility of including facilities that were, quote, under imminent threat of collapse. And the final direction from our committee was a discussion on if you are going to have a temporary housing set aside, how would you do that based on need? So I believe staff is prepared to address those three directions today. We didn't have an opportunity to hear a complete presentation from staff at our last meeting, so we'll begin, Dave, with whatever you want to do to pick us up, but go through the options so we and the stakeholders can hear what those options are, and then we'll ask folk to address them. We do have a full subcommittee meeting. For the record, I'd like to welcome Assemblymember Buchanan. I should also ask, do either one of you wish to say anything before we start into this program? David, it's all yours.
Last time, thank you, which had to do with the engineering seismic template reviews that we have been performing. As indicated in the report last time, there was additional funds left from the original grant from the Seismic Safety Commission. We have $77,000 left. We are also in the process of potentially receiving additional funding. We will be seeking additional dollars from the Seismic Safety Commission to augment the dollars that are left right now. We'll report out on that later. So with that regard, we're thinking with the various options here in front of us today, and based on the direction we receive, there will be an increased need for seismic review. So we want to ensure that there's enough money in the short term to address those types of issues. With respect to the imminent threat of collapse, which is on page 3, bottom of page 3, starting there, as Mr. Harvey mentioned earlier, there was a request from members at the last meeting to bring back a synopsis of what had occurred, what had been directed, and to summarize essentially at the August 2009 board meeting, the State Allocation Board requested DSA to make recommendations for potential amendments to the Seismic Mitigation Program, particularly looking at the threat of imminent collapse to see if maybe we're missing things, maybe things could be expanded. And the board also directed at that time, back in August of 2009, that whatever is brought back should not create a situation where we would create an unfunded list or exceed the authority of the program that was approved by the voters, $199.5 million, or up to $199.5 million. So with that said, at the March 2010 Implementation Committee meeting and board meetings subsequent to that, the DSA reported after they researched this issue that there was no scientific basis or clear definition at that point for the term imminent collapse. And without such clarity and definition, it may be problematical in the evaluation of buildings, and it could be subjective and potentially create a scenario for opening it up to the point where you overtax, overexpend the authority currently provided in the program. So the board accepted the DSA report in March of 2010 and requested further discussion of the stakeholders for promoting participation and facilitating the release of the Seismic Mitigation Program funding. Those discussions continue to today, so we're here to continue that endeavor. The next section I'd like to touch on, and this is another thing that Mr. Harvey mentioned we had received direction on to bring back, further discuss, explore, is with respect to the interim housing issue and what is appropriate in essence for the Seismic Mitigation Program as it relates to interim housing. So I will again state that currently in the school facility program, we do not provide additional grants for interim housing, and that would be in modernization or new construction or any other facility hardship. However, these are allowable costs in the program. In other words, the grants that are provided, they are allowable expenditures, and really I think what we're discussing here is whether or not we augment the current allowances provided in this program. In addition, I should note that facility hardship projects that are also financial hardship that meet that criteria, in other words, they have, severe financial issues in meeting their local matching share, there is an allowance in the regulations in the program to allow the district to reserve funds for these interim housing purposes, in essence to allow them to have an allowance for interim housing out of their own funds and not deem that money available as contribution. So with all that said as a backdrop, now looking at it, we went back and looked at the various options. And let me digress here to talk about the three scenarios. It's a little bit complex. I'll try to go high level here, and hopefully this will make sense for everybody. There are, in essence, three different options, three different roads to go when you're a facility hardship. One would be a Seismic Mitigation Program facility hardship rehabilitation project. And how you distinguish that is there are basic criteria in the program that have to do with how you're eligible for the program. One would be there's a life and safety type issue. That's one of the root criteria for facility hardship, as well as a seismic mitigation program and the additional criteria which we're talking about. But in addition to that, there's a cost threshold that has to be met. If you do not exceed the 50% of the current replacement value, you fall into what we call a seismic mitigation program rehab project, meaning your costs associated with your project are not so high that you would exceed that threshold, which would trigger, when DSA is looking at these kinds of projects, all the fire life safety requirements, get you up to current code. So these rehab projects, how we deal with those types of projects are we get a cost estimate. And that cost estimate delineates the essential work that is necessary to mitigate the various seismic limitations or issues with an existing building structure. And that's what the cost estimate has to do with. Now, the state in the seismic mitigation program will share in 50% of the costs associated with that cost estimate. So in looking at that as staff, we identified an area where this may be a problem, a serious problem for school districts that have to essentially bear all of those costs on their own, since the costs in the estimate are only seismic mitigation related repair costs or rehab costs. And we felt that this is an area that you folks may want to consider and provide additional direction to us, whether you want us to go down the path here. And this I should caution that this may require some additional legal analysis, if we are to go down this road. With that said, also if we receive direction to look at the facility hardship rehabilitation option, there are two other options. And let me digress again now. And these are not the rehab options. This is where a facility hardship exceeds the 50% of the replacement cost. So that's what I'm talking about now. We have the larger scale facility hardship seismic projects where the 50% of the current replacement value is exceeded. And there are two options under that. One would be a partial replacement, where we would provide a square foot additional a square footage allowance. It's right in the regulation for the types of facilities and the square footage. In addition, we would provide additional grants and excessive cost hardship grants to augment that square footage allotment that's provided. In addition, there's a post-school replacement facility hardship seismic project where we would provide the per pupil grants in that scenario and additional and excessive cost hardship grants. So in the vein of that, and with my earlier discussion about what we looked at, we did an analysis of the various costs, kind of comparing a similar type situation across the three options that I mentioned, the one option in rehab versus the partial or full school replacement. And we tried to kind of look at it from a, what the allowances look like. And it appeared that there were wide swings. Obviously, it's a general example that we looked at, but it appeared that the allowances were not all generally consistent, that there were swings in the costs provided. So if we receive direction from you folks to look at the rehabilitation interim housing, you may want us to potentially, if you want us to look at these other scenarios, the partial and the full school replacement facility hardships. If that's something you want us to look at, we could look at that also from an equity standpoint, if you want us to also look at those other scenarios. But right now, what we have in front of us, it does appear to be a cogent argument that we can make related to the rehabilitation, that an interim housing, if you consider it, could be something that we could look at, and a good argument could be made for that. Beyond that, we'd seek your direction. So that's kind of a discussion about that particular area, and again, it would require some legal review if we receive direction from you, depending on how far you want us to go on this. So with that said, let's move on to the next issue. I'm on page 5, reevaluating current seismic mitigation program criteria. And if I can summarize briefly here, we have heard loud and clear from various stakeholders in various venues, various meetings, either at the State Allocation Board, the Implementation Committee meetings, or the Seismic Safety Commission meetings, where we have reported out in various meetings of those types, that the stakeholders believe in some cases that the current program criteria may be too restrictive and potentially an impediment to accessing the seismic mitigation program funds. And the issue gets worse when you have a design that maybe doesn't exactly fit the boxes that we currently have in the seismic mitigation program. We have certain categories included in this item on attachment 2. You can look at that later if you want to really get into that level of detail. But those are the boxes, those are the building types that are currently recognized, currently codified in our regulations for the seismic mitigation program. So if you don't fit one of those nice, neat little boxes or category areas, and you're not in the right seismic zone, you're out. You don't qualify. Now, we've run into some situations, and there was some testimony at the last hearing, as a matter of fact, where we had a gentleman who was in a 1.82 spectral acceleration zone, but his building type was kind of a mix of one of the most vulnerable building categories. It was kind of an odd duck kind of thing here. So stakeholders vindicated, in those kinds of situations where you have a hybrid building, that's problematical. It can be an issue of, having it fit nice and neat into one of these boxes that we've created, if I can use that analogy. In addition, there's other factors that the stakeholders have mentioned repeatedly, such as the spectral acceleration zone, whether the threshold's too high or too low. That's obviously all debatable. The age of the facility, the overall maintenance of the facility, overall structural condition of the building, inadequate earthquake retrofits, past ones. You know, there's been a series of building code changes over time. There may have been retrofits that have taken place, but maybe they're an old 40s style building code retrofit that maybe isn't up to code, you know, with the more modern, more stringent earthquake standards, so if I can throw that out here. And lastly, site liquefaction issues, or perhaps also issues of active earthquake faults. And there's a lot of debate and speculation that goes along with those active earthquake faults. How active are the faults? You know, what's the proximity of the earthquake fault? What's the soil condition? You get into a lot of these issues that I'm not prepared to talk about today, other than to say those are issues that we may want to also look at. And we have some experts here from the Seismic Safety Commission, and I believe we have some experts from DSA that perhaps could speak to that if you want more information on that. So with all that said, depending on where we go with this, and I'm about to get into some proposals and ask for some direction, but depending on how far we go, how ambitious we are, I would just like to say that there is always the risk of exceeding the authority in the program, going beyond the $199.5 million, depending on what we do. So finding that balance to, you know, come up with a program that provides flexibility, but at the same time not creating some huge need beyond what the voters have currently approved. That's one of the risks here in what we're doing today. So with that said, I'd like to move into an idea, an issue that was brought forward by representatives from DSA, the acting state architect, and the Seismic Safety Commission. They brought up and felt that something we should perhaps look at that provides some flexibility for school districts in certain cases. And I'd like to talk about this incremental seismic upgrades part that's at the bottom of page 5 in the item. And I'd like to introduce it as, this isn't the be-all, end-all, but it is an option here. You know, you notice that there's been a lot of issues talked about in the past about the local matching share, that the local matching share, if it's a full scope seismic project, it includes not only the seismic work, but it includes, you know, all the eligible costs in a school facility project, you know, the additional grants, the excessive cost hardship grants, which can increase the overall total project cost, which half of that is the district's share if they're not financial hardship. In addition to that, when you do these full scope projects, you're going to have to bring that building up to current code too, as far as all the fire life safety requirements. So that also, all these things in combination can serve to be an issue for a district that has limited resources. So with that as a backdrop, I would like to provide this option, this idea that has been brought up recently, and provide it to you folks as this is a potential option to address a couple of the issues. This incremental seismic upgrade is a voluntary seismic upgrade which allows a school district to go in and essentially scalpel out work that needs to be done, and it allows for a much smaller approach, a less, you know, bigger, larger scope project that I was speaking to earlier, but allows you to go in and address those seismic issues that need to be addressed and not have to bring that building up to current building code. In addition, you don't have a lot of those eligible school facility program additional and excessive cost hardship grants added on. You could just go in and, if you wanted to minimize your costs, your funding share in this case, you could go in and you could look at this kind of a project, this incremental approach, and perhaps schedule it during the summer, which addresses the second issue, which is the interim housing issue also. So this is something we want to provide. This is an option that could go through, and you could use it. You could use it as an option depending on what option. Of the 3 options we provide, you could plug this right in here. It's one of the array of options for a school district to use. So with that said, we would like to provide that and seek direction from the seismic subcommittee on that. I would like to also say that with respect to this incremental approach, it is my thought that these would probably all be except in rare circumstances, these would be the seismic mitigation rehab options. You'd probably be under the 50% of the current replacement type situation since you're going in and doing smaller, limited work, short duration type projects. So that's something to think about here as far as that. Going back to the interim housing also, with this approach here, you can schedule the work, attain minimum disruption of staff and students. Another one of the primary drivers of this proposal here that I'm putting forward. So with that said, if we could get into the options, and in option 1, which we provided last time, this is the option that would lower the spectral acceleration zone from our current 1.68 threshold to 1.65 for a period of 6 months and continue to lower that threshold by increments of 0.3 in 6-month windows until the $199.5 million of the Prop 1D funds are fully subscribed. That's one option for you to consider today. The second option,
if I might,
yes.
As a point of clarity, I'm reading between the lines because it's not affirmatively said here, but it sounds as if the window is open. If you don't take advantage of that opportunity when the window's open and you close it and go down to the next increment, you've lost your opportunity to apply.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
You'd still exceed the number. Why would you? In other words, if we lower it to 1.65 and then it goes down to 1.62, you're saying that if you were at 1.66 or 1.65, you couldn't apply if you didn't apply within that 6-month time frame?
If you think about our current priorities for funding rounds that we've had, it would be similar to that kind of mentality that we would open up competition rounds, if I can use that terminology. It'd be a 6-month round. We've lowered the threshold. Come one, come all. If you're within that window,
so you
come in during that period. And if we move on, we move on.
You're making the assumption that all these school districts have had the engineering reports done. They know exactly which buildings qualify. They have all that information right now, and they're ready to go. They just aren't at the right factor.
That would be one assumption you could make.
So yes. The district 12 months from now had was doing modernization or whatever, or had reason to have engineers go in and take a look at a building, and that building was at 1.6. But now your factor had been lowered to 1.5, and they didn't know that? They wouldn't qualify? You're
absolutely correct, Assemblymember Buchanan, and that is one of our cons here, that you potentially leave higher, more vulnerable buildings behind by this option, but you hit right on it. That is one of the cons here to this option.
I would just say that we would not support the second part of the recommendation for a variety of circumstances could occur for a district that may want to come in but couldn't come in at the specific time that was provided. They still meet the criteria. It may be that their 50% was not available to them. It may be that they didn't discover that they were eligible. It may be a whole host of issues. So I, for one, would not support restricting as we move down the criteria. I'm not sure I'm there with that option in total yet. Anyway, I think we have a lot of discussion to go, but I wouldn't support that.
That's good to know, and of course we can direct staff any number of ways depending on the discussion and our own preference. I think inherent in this, and it's inherent in some of the complaints from any number of sources, is why isn't the money being utilized? Not only have you created these arbitrary narrow criteria, but you haven't done a decent job of providing opportunities. And I think inherent in here is you make some adjustments, you give people an opportunity to access it. If you want to keep it open longer, fine. You go down to the next increment. You're opening up more opportunity, and ideally the money is expended appropriately but more quickly.
There's one big assumption there, and that is that the SA factor is the right evaluative tool for need. And we heard, we at our last or two SAB meetings ago with Morongo, where certainly the current criteria didn't work. We heard with Piedmont where they felt their most distressed building didn't qualify despite the fact that it had a higher factor than currently eligible. So for a program like this to work, you have to assume, one, that the criteria is the best criteria to use, and two, that districts are in a position where they're ready to move forward. And so I'm not sure on either one, but I know we've got two more alternatives to talk about.
Well, we may want to jump right over to 3 because 2 is a subset of what we just talked about, and I've heard concerns on both ends of option 1. And Juan, did you have something you wish to add before we move on?
Just to clarify, the 6-month timeline, it's a time period for school districts to come in and request a conceptual approval, meaning that at that point, they don't have to have plans approved by the Division of State Architect or the Department of Education, and they also wouldn't need to have their local match. They come in, they get a conceptual approval by the board, then they get that approval, then typically the board grants them up to 18 months to go out and get the plans approved. So I just wanted to clarify that the 6 months is just for a conceptual approval to come in.
Well, it isn't, and it's not. I mean, often having been on the school board of one of the projects that was approved under this, one of the 4 projects that was approved, I mean, until they were going in to modernize, and the architect said, I think we need to look at this, we had to have a number of different engineers, including soils engineers, and we found the liquefaction and all those problems. I mean, you're assuming schools are ready to go in, and I think there's a significant amount of work that you know, leads up to that, and I don't know exactly at what point in that. I mean, the process, it took probably even to get to the point where we knew the building had to be evacuated and replaced. I'd say it took the better part of a year to get there with all the different engineering studies. So.
And that was a full scope project, is that correct? That would be a larger.
That ended up being, well, it was a replacement project for a gym, but it was.
Okay.
But you know, I mean, it's all. I guess my only point is that it's, you know, determining the structural integrity of these buildings with respect to, you know, potential seismic activity, and maybe this is just my own experience, is not an easy. It's not a really simple task. It's not a matter of assigning a number and looking at the kind of construction. I think it's more complex than that.
I say amen to that. As we've had 2 or 3 in-depth discussions about this, it's a very good point. Lisa, did you wish to add something?
I would like to add, too, just like Juan stipulated that, you know, I think 6 months window it could be flexible. I mean, I think we could talk about, if that's a concept that we want to be married with, I think we could work on that timeline. Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? Is it 12 months? But I think there's still some viability there. I just want to throw that as an option.
It's a step-down approach, and we can talk about the factors that make it work or not work. I will jump to option 3 unless either one of you have a compelling interest to have option 2 discussed. It's keeping the factor at 1.68 until we make absolutely certain that everybody has been identified, but it doesn't address your issue a lot. Is that a good standard? So if you don't have a compelling reason here about option 2, we'll go right into option 3. And maybe we'll have some questions about this incremental approach. And I would like to hear, if appropriate, from Seismic Safety and or DSA when we finish our option 3, if they choose to speak. Otherwise, we appreciate you're here to answer our questions. Option 3, then.
Thank you. So before I get into option 3, I need to clarify one of the numbers we have in here as the potential carve-out within this option. We just had one of the 8, if you recall from last time, there was a total of 38 buildings that were reviewed with our uniform seismic template. 20 of them met all the criteria in the program, so they're otherwise eligible in the program. 18 were not. One of the 18 project buildings was reassessed, and we just found out the results of that late yesterday. So there's now 21 buildings rather than 20. So some of these numbers here, as of this late here, I didn't want to create confusion. So I just want to clarify that we built in numbers associated with this 21st one. So the $114 million, if you could just jot a note there, it's $104 million would be the amount that's left. This is a very big building in this 21st building. It's 41,500 feet. It looks like a very big project. So we tried to estimate costs for a carve-out to also take care of this latest one we've just discovered. So with that said, the option 3 is to discontinue the current seismic mitigation program that we have right now. In essence, try to open the thing up, make it more flexible, maybe move away from some of the boxes that we have, set boxes, and this is the only thing we'll look at. It would provide more flexibility, and we would be seeking some clarity with regard to whether or not if we were to carve out, instead of the 114, the 104 million, if we in essence stop the program, allow for a set aside for the 21 projects now, in addition to the conceptual approval that Juan mentioned for West Contra Costa County. We have one of those also. Allowing for all of those projects to come forward under the old program, the old criteria, we have 104 million estimated left. So one of the questions would be whether or not we provide for a carve-out, create a new seismic mitigation program, and actually separately account for that 104 million that we, in essence, open up a new, more flexible program with. So that would be one decision point that I would seek direction from you folks on. The next one would be that I would strongly recommend and also seek direction from you folks relative to standards. What are the standards we would employ if we do move this 104 million over into a facility hardship? In essence, it's a newer, less restrictive seismic mitigation program, but looks at other things. You know, it would appear to me that you would need to have some kind of a spectral acceleration threshold set, maybe a variation on option one, maybe some kind of variable rate that we look at periodically. But I believe that's something that should be looked at, and I would seek direction on. And also, Category 2 buildings, there needs to be some specificity in the regulations so districts know what the heck the rules are. If we are to change this, if we go down this road, there should be some regulatory changes that would specify, you know, what the processes are associated with identifying these Category 2 buildings. This would allow school districts to essentially, this option, to basically raise their hand and say, yeah, I think I've got a Category 2 building, and whether or not we set a spectral acceleration zone or not, there needs to be some clarity and direction standards associated with this in order to make this thing continue to move forward as we are now. Perhaps, if I can throw a suggestion out, one thing we could look at to add clarity to this is maybe we have an optional seismic template right now in use. It's not required, it's not mandated, but you know, if that's something you wanted to maybe have as a standard template, that you have to go through this template process and use that. That helps to identify rapidly whether you meet certain criteria. We could amend it and, you know, require that as maybe a standard way of assessing the building and whether it's Category 2, that kind of thing. And then lastly, I touched on the regulations. I believe that, and I would seek direction whether or not you folks agree that due to the urgency of trying to get the money out, trying to aggressively move forward on this program, I heard the board loud and clear last time, especially with the establishment of this subcommittee to ferret out these issues and come back with proposals. I would also think that emergency regulations to come back to the board at the appropriate time, once we have clear direction, would be the next order also, with your approval on that and direction.
I have a couple questions on this.
Absolutely. We'll go to committee questions, of course.
So first I just want to understand where we've arrived at residual funds and where we are with the existing funds. Currently, as I understand, there were four projects that qualified. Mm-hmm. Do we, in this program, do conceptual approval?
In the current program, we do conceptual approvals, yes.
So their reservation of funds is at the conceptual approval. Is that correct or not? No. The
conceptual approval, like, for instance, West Contra Costa County, we just have an estimated number there that could go up or down, and then they have 18 months to come in with an actual funding request.
So
where the money would be reserved.
So our estimated amount here is simply based on conceptual that we know at the time, but we are not reserving these funds for these folks at this moment.
Well, okay, let's back up here for a second. 3 projects have been funded in the seismic mitigation program.
They have been funded.
Right? The 4th project in the seismic mitigation, the West Contra Costa County, is a conceptual, and no dollars are reserved. There's nothing reserved. Then these 21 projects, which we carved out money for estimated costs, there's no money reserved there. It's just an estimated number we came up with as a carve-out, if we want to go down this road here, to when these projects come to fruition. We've allowed enough money on the table there.
Are we just carving out for the purpose of discussion here today, or are we actually reserving funds for these projects?
Well,
So for instance, if I'm a project and I think I have funding, and lo and behold, everybody comes in before me with a DSA approval, and I was one of the 21, who gets the money?
I think that's what we're going to recommend. I think that's our call.
Okay, so, but currently we do not have conceptual approval and we do not have reservation of funds. So
That's
the
essentially
estimates
correct.
here are simply estimates of if someone wanted to perhaps come forward 18 months from now with a DSA approved project.
or sometime sooner, yes.
Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question before you ask your next question? So is a conceptual approval, is that basically a notice to the district that their project qualifies, or is that any kind of commitment of funds?
It isn't technically a commitment of funds, but it is an approval of the project, that they meet all program criteria. But they still have, with 18 months to meet all the criteria to come in. Do you want to add anything, Juan, to that? I mean, that's the requirement.
Just to add to that, to date, the way the program works is that there has not been a reservation of bond authority at the conceptual stage. It's basically the project meets the criteria, but then when they come in with the funding application, it's at that point that the bond authority is reserved. That's the way the program's been managed to date.
So the conceptual approval is notice to the district that their project is eligible.
Correct.
And that then they have to go through the other additional steps before they're actually funded. So it's not a guarantee of funding, it's a notice that the project is eligible and does qualify.
That's how it's worked so far.
To go further into that, Assemblymember Buchanan, without plans, without CD approval of those plans, DSA approval of the plans, the project's dead on arrival. So obviously there are a lot of other steps beyond. The conceptual approval gives the district the assurances that the project's eligible, but they still have to get the plans, meet all the requirements to go forward. And there are a whole series of requirements for facility hardship that they have to meet for the project to be funded and viable.
That's exactly what I wanted to clarify, thank you.
Okay, good. That was part for me too. I think it actually is perhaps part of the puzzle here. And it may be one that we have, that we can discuss as a subcommittee. I certainly have an opinion on it as one subcommittee member. I'm aware, am I correct, that we have other programs in the whole, under the whole statute that do receive conceptual approval and reservation of funds at the time they come in. Is that correct? Like critically overcrowded schools,
charter,
charter
yes.
and overcrowded relief.
Yes.
Right. So the idea of a conceptual approval and reservation of funds has been one that we have utilized in other programs.
Yes.
Okay. And the reason I pursue this line of questioning is because one of the issues that I hear concern about is, will there be funding there after I go through all this due diligence and after I come and arrive at my project and I actually do have to do it regardless if the state is there at that point? And that's a risk factor for the district and a trust factor of the program. So it may be one that we need to look at. In essence, today, as you're giving us information, you're actually thinking in that manner that there's only 104 million left. Well, that's really not true. What's true is there's been 20 million accessed in this program, period. And the fact that there's potential for up to 104, or potential for 114 or 104 more is a whole different story, I think, because there's a long time between that and actual access. So perhaps one of the issues that we should be discussing is a conceptual approval and reservation of fund at the time we know that the project qualifies.
If I could just add to that, to the chair, that's exactly correct, Ms. Moore. I think that the way the option 3 is currently structured, it does take into account the sort of reservation of bond authority for the projects that have received an evaluation, but don't necessarily have plan approvals yet. So
But it's not real.
Correct.
It's just
Correct.
for purposes of discussion today.
Purposes of discussion, yes.
I keep coming back to, my thoughts originally, and so I just want to kind of walk you through my logic here, okay? Prop D funding was approved in 2006, right? So we're 5 years into this, and we spent basically $20 million out of $200 million. And we've had legislation passed asking to, determine which schools are eligible. We've had, work that you've done, which even the most recent work only covered a fraction of the school districts in California. And the only reason we spent any money is because we lowered the SA factor by a couple of points for them to qualify. So that's sort of where we've been in the last 5 years. At a previous SAB meeting, we had a school, Moronga, that they had to evacuate, right? They showed us the lines with all the faults. Their engineer said it's not safe to have children in this school. The DSA agreed that it wasn't safe to have children in that school, except they didn't technically meet the seismic qualifications, so they were caught between a rock and a hard spot. And what we ultimately did for that school is we approved a facilities hardship grant where they got the same 50% funding they would have gotten, allowing them to move forward. We heard significant testimony at our last meeting, but we heard about Piedmont, where they talked about, Mr. Hancock talked about 3 schools, and the 2 that qualified, they didn't feel were as in critical condition as the one that didn't, but because of the criteria, they were unable to get any funds for that. So, the way I'm looking at it is the program guidelines right now, I don't care how we talk about the numbers or whatever, but they're clearly not working. So I really think there are 2 questions we have to answer. One question is, what should the guidelines be for qualifying schools for seismic funds? The other question has to be in terms of how are we going to award the grant money? And I'd like to see us tackle those 2 questions separately because, you could leave the seismic program the way it is and have criteria that maybe, in my mind, make more sense. You could fold the seismic funds into the facilities hardship, which is where we funded the Moronga, which I think, from my point of view, ultimately makes sense, even if you want to keep those funds segregated, because that's what happens. Or, you could leave it the way it is, and when we go with the, hopefully, 2012 bond, come up with a new program. But I think to the extent we simplify it, the better. Now, from my perspective, I just want to talk about how do schools meet the criteria. Continually lowering the SA factor, to me, is not necessarily going to get at the problem. I don't think we can afford, as a state, to go out and inspect 10,000 schools to find out which ones, need work and which ones don't. Because we have a state program that's really designed to complement and support the building programs of school districts. And school districts, their boards and the superintendent are responsible for building and maintaining schools. And so we need a program, I think, that works at that. And I'm going to go back to proposing that if you have engineers at the local level who determine that a school is not safe for children or staff to be housed, and you have DSA that concurs with that, and the reason is because of potential seismic activity, I think that should be enough to qualify them for seismic funds. I don't think this SA factor with building type and how do you get into mixed and whether you technically qualify or not, I'm not sure, and or going out and trying to survey more schools, I'm not sure that solves the problem. I think the real question has to be, is it safe for children to be in the school? Now, that's not to say that DSA shouldn't have some kind of set of criteria which it uses, but clearly it used some criteria when it agreed with the engineers on the Moronga situation. So I'd like to maybe see if it makes sense to separate this into 2 different issues there.
Do you want to respond?
Yes.
You can go first, because we both
I
talked.
think that is a nice way of bifurcating our discussion, and I think you've laid out a coherent policy option for us to consider. I mean, very clearly, we stick with what we have and lower the factors therein incrementally. Or we do something that is a little far-reaching and a little more liberal, ensuring that the finding is safety and concurrence by DSA. Bottom line is you move the money. And I finally agree that you don't necessarily have to make it a subset. You can keep it the way it is and just redefine the standards. Or you can move it over as a subset. But I, for one, believe with the voters giving us the authority to set up to for seismic, we owe it to them, we owe it to those that have asked us to look at this issue to make sure we have integrity for seismic mitigation.
And even if you moved it over to facilities hardship, you could still have a seismic program as a sub-program within that. Because one of the issues, I believe, is that what happens if all your $200 million gets used up because you're now going to replace schools that are unsafe? If a school comes in after that and they determine it's unsafe, are they not going to qualify? I mean, it's...
Isn't the seismic program already a subset of the hardship program? So it already is a subset.
The funding is separate.
Separate, but it's
Yes.
a subset of that program, correct?
And it's a subset because the facility hardship program, stepping away from the seismic mitigation program, deals with the potential for collapse versus an actual health and safety issue right now in the present. There's a little bit of a different way of looking at it.
I would just offer our thinking on this. It's a little bit different, completely open to your thought process on how we might approach it best. But here's our thinking on it as well. And the voters asked us to look at the most vulnerable California school facilities. And we've had responses from our stakeholders as to why they have not accessed those funds. And the responses that they indicated that I think are quantified here for the May 6, 2010 Implementation Committee meeting were the lack of funding for upfront costs for the structural evaluation. We've tackled that a bit. We have not tackled that for the entire AB 300 list. And I'm interested in your further comments. I think later, Dave, you said you would talk a little bit more about what we might have in store from the Seismic Safety Commission on those surveys. But we've looked at that a little bit, but we have not actually addressed that concern to its completeness from school districts. The second highest issue that districts indicated to us was the lack of local match for school districts. I think that actually is one of the larger issues that we're dealing with here, specifically in this era of where school districts are grappling with their budgets, regardless if they're capital budgets, which we know are different than operational. But the lack of local match for school districts, we have not ever addressed that as a recommendation here to the committee. And I'm wondering if there is something there that we actually, if the voters have asked us to look at the most vulnerable buildings and to take care of them, if this is sitting in the way of that, then perhaps we need to look at it. And I don't know if we can legally. Maybe if it has to happen legislatively, tell me. But is there a better scale? Is it 75% state, 25% district? Is it 100% state? If we actually are going to take care of the most vulnerable school buildings.
At this point, all the legal analysis is we need to change the law if we're going to move in that direction towards.
What direction?
Move in the direction of paying the district share if they're not financial hardship.
What about less than 50, more than 50%?
I'm of the opinion we'd have to check with our legal counsel to verify, but I think we need legislation to address that.
I would like to know the definitive answer to that. So as we
the law talks about a 50-50
deliberate
program.
this, I think that's an important factor. It's the second highest issue that districts said why they are not accessing the funding. Then the third issue is lack of interim housing. And we're supportive of interim housing, and we're supportive of interim housing not restricted. We're supportive of interim housing for the seismic program. Now, I do believe there's a reasonable factor and that school districts should be required to look at the site, and if there's any existing space on that site, that is utilized first. And in fact, if they are leaving the site because of its completely demolishing, if there's an empty school nearby, that is interim housing, and that we look at those kinds of issues, and then we provide an augmentation for interim housing. Again, districts, since this program began, have indicated to us that is one of the impediments. So I'd say we address it. And then if we, look at the building types, I don't know. I think that if you address those three issues, I don't know that you need to reduce criteria. And we're dealing with the highest vulnerable school projects, and we are taking care of them. Another approach. So I don't know.
So these criteria were come up with at the implementation committee. So do we actually survey school districts, or are these, how do we come up with these?
It was the feedback that school districts gave as to why they were not accessing the program. I can't say, I don't know if it was through survey, through testimony. It also has been indicated at each of our, at times that we have looked at this issue as a school, as a board, each of the agenda items. These are the issues that have been raised, and we have not taken any further action on these items. They've always been raised to the State Allocation Board, but they have not been acted upon. And perhaps it is time to act on those items.
A point of clarification, actually, we have, you're right, heard the request, and up to this point, the board has not agreed that those are eligible activities.
The board has not added those in, I would say.
And recommendations in the board did not.
Well, I think it's slightly, in March of 2009, it says no options were approved by the board, and it had interim housing, it had the structural, it had an unfunded list. But as I went back and researched, it was a report, so the board can't take action on a report. So it was in a report mode that it came to the board. Now, whether in August it must have been in an action mode, because we did take action on a couple of things. But that's what I'm saying. It's been in the reports, and I believe that if the stakeholders continue to tell us this is why we're not accessing the funds, if we are to try and make this program viable and actually do what the voters have asked us to do, that we should consider the stakeholders' input.
Yeah. If I could just a point of clarification, there's been a series of discussions. There was a March 2009 discussion. It was a report, no action item. There was an action item in August of 2009 where the board did make decisions. So, point of clarification. A couple other things real quick. As far as the local match, again, if I can hit on the incremental, we believe doesn't fully access that or deal with that, but it does allow for the local matching share to shrink dramatically, to the point where maybe a district can financially afford a much smaller, you go from a 30 million project down to $1 million, if I can use that example, sharing 15 million costs in a 30 million project versus, which is daunting, versus sharing 500,000 of $1 million, much smaller incremental approach is much less daunting from a financial perspective. And as far as the most vulnerable Category 2 buildings, the proposal on option 3, just so we don't lose sight of that, that's what was in the original approval by the voters, was that Category 2 buildings are the most vulnerable buildings. That was kind of enumerated in the law, so we don't get too far away from that.
And I wasn't saying getting far away from that. I was saying the impediments that have been advised to the board are cost sharing, are interim housing, and are, the third one, the structural evaluation. And I am interested in hearing more about what the expansion of the structural evaluation, particularly to as many AB 300 identified buildings as possible.
Tom, if you would, you may be able to stay right there, but I did indicate I'd like to have an opportunity for either the Seismic Safety Commission representative and or DSA to say something they wish to before we hear from the stakeholder community.
And I'll sit down, but I only wanted to give you some data that we recently acquired that is in direct support of what Ms. Moore just identified.
And we'll hear that during your testimony.
Okay, thank you. Just want to have a placeholder for that.
You absolutely.
Okay,
we always enjoy hearing from you.
Thank you.
You don't have to move too far, perhaps, because if DSA and or Seismic Safety do not wish to say anything but only remain for our questions, that's fine too. Do either one of these agencies wish to state anything for the record at this point? I see heads going negative, so we appreciate that you're here. Excuse me. For the record, if you identify yourself and give the clarification.
Thank you. I'm Fred Turner with the staff of the Seismic Safety Commission. We don't have any prepared statement, but maybe just to correct for the record Dave Zion's statement about option 1. I think you said 0.3G as a next step increment. I believe that the term is 0.03G, just so the record could be corrected. Thank you.
Appreciate that. It is correctly written in the agenda item as 0.03, but it's nice to have it on the record. Thank you for that clarification. Any other committee questions or statements before we hear from the stakeholder? Trying to respect the fact that we only do have a half hour left unless we wish to go longer, but I'm respectful of people's personal time. We will give an update of where we are at the board meeting next week. We have a goal. Tomorrow. My, how time flies. It's tomorrow. We have a goal of giving a committee recommendation to the May board meeting. That may necessitate another committee meeting, but we'll take it as it comes. But that was our direction. Try to do something by May with an update tomorrow at the board meeting. Okay, now we are open for statements from those of you in the audience who have been so very patient. Mr. Duffy, I knew you would be back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Tom Duffy for the Coalition for Adequate School Housing. We had a seminar on AB3, or webinar on AB 300 just recently, and this went for about an hour and 15 minutes. It was attended online and by phone by 100 people, and at the conclusion, we had some survey questions for them that I think may inform your discussion, and Ms. Moore is directly in line with some of your comments about discussion at the implementation committee that you mentioned from 2010. Now, it's important to recognize that in the field, AB 300 and the seismic program are linked in the minds of school districts because of the Category 2 projects and what has been identified, especially recently in the press, about AB 300, the seismic program, and other issues. In the minds of school districts, if you're on the AB 300 list, you have a building that has been identified as being at risk in some form. Not sure at what level, but that there is a recommendation from DSA that you should look at that building in depth with an engineer. So that's in the minds of districts. So during this, and I don't have the document with me, but I do have it on my handheld. And this is the question. If you have not attempted to remove buildings from the AB 300 list, is the cost of the engineering review an impediment? Okay, there were 101 people on this. 61% said yes. So in direct support of that cost of the engineering review. Another question. If you have not attempted to remove buildings from the AB 300 list, is temporary housing an impediment? 83% said yes. So those two issues that we have long discussed as being impediments were identified, and we didn't manipulate this. It was simply the questions, and probably if we had worked longer on the questions, we may have shortened them up and maybe asked some more. But we're trying to gather information, not so much for this hearing, but in order to basically understand and to be able to inform policymakers.
So did those districts have money for their 50% match, just not for interim housing?
We don't know. That could be a further question. But I think to the three items that were brought up by Ms. Moore as being issues, I think, Ms. Moore, if I understood you, that you believe that if the structural engineering report, some question about dealing with local match, and then the interim housing issue, if those three things were dealt with, it seemed that you were saying that the issues of being able to qualify based upon the current eligibility and that 1.68 and those kinds of buildings that are identified, that may be resolve itself. I think that this information informs that. We don't know precisely the answer, but I would say that both interim housing and, which is a cost, Mr. Museum was saying earlier that you can certainly use your funds for interim housing if you had enough of those. If districts don't have enough for their match, they're not going to have enough for interim housing. And interim housing is clearly an issue, as I think we testified 2 weeks ago at the other hearing of this subcommittee.
And so how would you deal with the Piedmont situation where the shake factor was about 1.8 something?
For the third building?
Yeah. I mean, if the program's adequate and their worst school, which exceeds the shake factor, doesn't qualify, how would you deal with fixing that school?
I wouldn't argue that what exists today is the best. We know that it began at 1.7 and that it's been reduced to 1.68. 2 years ago, I have a document in my stack of documents here. 2 years ago, we made a recommendation to the allocation board to reduce it to 1.5, thinking that's a significant drop. We've seen documents since that time, within about the last month, that a recommendation from DSA some time ago was to begin at 1.25. So those are maybe academic exercises. At the real level, as you know, in Piedmont, the question was really, what do we do with these children? Because we believe we have a problem, whether or not we can get funding or not. We've got to do something with this building.
I think there's another real question, and another real question is our goal to just keep lowering the number, or is our goal to replace schools that are unsafe? And if a school's unsafe for a child or staff to be in, due to seismic conditions, it needs to be replaced. And so the question is does the SA number adequately reflect that, or is there a better way of determining whether or not the school is safe? Because these factors, I think, apply regardless of which method you have. But I point to the Moronga and I point to the Piedmont situation and say, if you lower the numbers to 1.5, it still wouldn't have funded schools when their engineers, DSA, in the Piedmont it wasn't, but agreed that the schools weren't safe. And they're so in my mind, you've got how do we determine what schools are safe? And we've been told that the engineers haven't come up with better numbers. I mean, because it's something you can't quantify. I mean, we've been told that's come up at several meetings now. So if you can't quantify that, lowering numbers doesn't necessarily mean that you're replacing schools that are more safe or less safe. Particularly, we're trying to get to the most vulnerable schools.
I agree with you.
I think it's what is the best way for determining whether or not a school is safe. The next is certainly in terms of how you fund in the impediments. And I guarantee you, if we provided full funding for engineering, full funding for the replacement, full funding for interim housing, we would probably have demand for over $1 billion. So, the program requires a 50% match. But again, second criteria was, what is that criteria? How do we make the funding? I mean, to provide that. And then the last one is where do we house the money? And the last one's probably the easiest to deal with.
Well, yes, if I may just take a couple more minutes. We recommended to the board a couple of years ago what has been discussed here today, and that is if a district has a report from an engineer that says this building is a problem building that may collapse because of ground shaking, that's significant. If anybody in this room has worked with a structural engineer to sign off on the structural integrity or lack thereof of a building, you know it's a difficult thing to get. What I testified to at your last hearing was that it appears to be easier, and certainly I've done this, it appears to be easier to get to a facility hardship than it is to a seismic project. And what is it in the facility hardship arena that gets you there? It's that structural engineer's report that says the building does not meet the code for the time that it was approved. It has a structural deficiency, or as Mr. Zian was saying, a health and safety risk and issue, confirmed by and agreed to, supported by DSA. Why can we not do this with this program? If a district is willing to take the risk of going to an engineer, and the engineer says, yes, you've got a building that may collapse, it may be damaged, people may be hurt if it happens during the school day, and they come to DSA and DSA agrees with them, why would we not, especially if that building is on the AB 300 list, but maybe it's not there, why would we not seek to support the district's endeavors? You identified, Ms. Buchanan, just a few minutes ago, that we've been dealing with this for almost 5 years, and we don't have a solution. What we keep talking about is reducing now over time this 1.7 factor, when in reality we have, I think we're down to about 4,500 buildings on the revised AB 300 list, and if a district is, one more time to repeat myself, is willing to take that risk for a superintendent to say to the board, we've got to get kids out of that building, and apply to DSA for their review and potential concurrence, why would we not support them in the structural engineer's report, at least allowing that to be part of their match or giving it to them if they're hardship? And then, and I agree with your comments and Ms. Moore's comments, I think even at the last meeting, that if the district's making some special endeavor to house children and they say we need more, give them some criteria for coming up with interim housing. This is not an easy.
And how is that in conflict? The AB 300 list, first of all, I'm not sure how accurate that whole list is, because I know you went to San Ramon and they didn't participate, but they didn't because there were still schools on that list that had been replaced 5 years ago. So that may or may not be the whole list. But so that shouldn't be in conflict with, if you went to approach like that with the AB 300 list, is it?
I don't think in conflict at all. I keep mentioning AB 300 because there is now this common belief that if you've got a building on the list, that building is a danger to children. So we've got to face that. And I think this program needs to begin to help to face that.
Well, the AB 300 list is a potential, right? I mean, like I said, I know that there was an article in our local papers, and there were, like I said, schools that have been torn down and replaced.
Maybe the state architect can speak to it better, but just as a general rule of thumb, the AB 300 list was established in 1999. Okay, there was no seismic mitigation program. So being on a AB 300 list, which was a paper survey, Chip can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, but there was, these buildings may have been demolished, sold, retrofitted. A lot of things could have happened. That list may not be accurate, first of all, but just being on that AB 300 list does not constitute eligibility. I want to just be real clear, and I don't think Tom was saying this either, but just being on that list doesn't mean you immediately come in the door and you're eligible for a seismic mitigation program.
I fully understand that, but
okay.
I want to be sure the public understands that, because the whole lot of buildings have been modernized or replaced since 1999, and so the public needs to understand that every building on that list, many of them that work has been done, and others may or may not qualify depending on
absolutely
the
correct. But
reports.
just to make sure that I responded, but the comment Mr. Ruzine made, Dave, the reason for the seismic program in AB in 127, Proposition 1D, is because of the AB 300 list. We went to Ellen Corbett in 2003. She authored a bill for us. She was the author of AB 300. She authored a bill for us. I have a copy of it right here. It was AB 1790. It identifies the things that we're talking about here to create a program to resolve the issues of the AB 300 list. That bill never made it out of Senate Education because of what? It was, we don't have bond funds for that. So it ended up in 1D. And in 1D, we couldn't get that project or that program going well. We went to Lonnie Hancock. She authored Senate Bill 375. 375 identifies the things that we're talking about here. If you look at 375 from 2009. So we've been discussing this without resolution for some time. The AB 300 list is totally imperfect, and I agree with you. But the public and now some school districts believe that, in fact, if you're on that list and the building still exists, then you've got a problem building. That may be a place to begin, but I think making sure that the structural engineer's report is a cost that is included in your project cost if you're a 50-50 project, and that you have interim housing costs, and that if you're a hardship district, that both those costs could be dealt with. And then if you open the door to allowing a structural engineer to identify in a report that they sign their name and they've got their license on, they take that to DSA, and DSA says, we agree with you, why is that not enough? Because it's enough under the facility hardship program. So thank you very much. I appreciate your
If we may on that issue,
time.
And I have a follow-up. Please go ahead.
I'm wondering, we heard from our state architect last meeting concerning, the criteria in that issue. I would be interested to hear from our representative from the Seismic Safety Commission about their thoughts on criteria and or structural engineer reports, if they could address us.
That'll be up to them, but let me make a comment. Tom, I'm going to respectfully request that you do all you can in your publications to de-link AB 300 from what this discussion is all about, because it is indeed an imperfect document. When we did our first update of it, a number of schools came off for the very reasons that Assemblymember Buchanan alluded to. Districts said, why was this on here to begin with? It no longer houses kids. We've demolished it. We've already retrofitted it. And the number began to drop dramatically when we did our first iteration for funding at the 1.7. So I hope anybody who has the mighty pen continues to make the case with us that this was an exercise that helped frame the need, potential gross need, for a bond. It did that, but it does not constitute a building at risk necessarily, nor does it constitute eligibility, and we need to continue to say those things. Please.
Sure. Just for the sake of history, I'm Fred Turner with the staff of the Seismic Safety Commission. I'm a structural engineer. We also have Henry Reyes here from our staff as well. The commission sponsored AB 300, and so we're well aware of all the history behind that, as well as we have been advised and kept abreast of your efforts and also DSA's efforts over the years, and we were instrumental in advising the State Allocation Board on its most recent changes to these regulations. And so we have been monitoring and where appropriate, helping advise your office over the years, and we're basically supportive of the direction that you're going in. We are concerned about whether or not you might be not able to meet the most vulnerable criteria if you were to go with option 3, unless you continued to somehow restrict eligibility to some level that would provide some reasonable level of ranking in most vulnerable buildings. And I think perhaps another bit of history, the Commission has been around for over 35 years. We've dealt with this issue for state-owned buildings. And if I could give you a little vignette, we had similar problems with state-owned buildings in the 1980s when the Department of Finance and the legislative analysts refused to fund any state-owned buildings until the first most vulnerable building was retrofitted. And that happened to be a bicycle shop at UC Berkeley. And UC Berkeley didn't want to retrofit that building, and that was holding up hundreds of retrofit projects because the most vulnerable building was not being addressed.
How was the most vulnerable building determined?
We had a ranking at that point that was developed by a very low cost, $100 per building evaluation, probably much less intensive than the current AB 300 inventory. And it, too, was quite flawed in many respects. And we went back to the experts that developed that inventory, and they acknowledged that really you could lump the buildings, given all the uncertainties, into categories of 3. The top third, clearly if you retrofitted any of those, you would be pretty well advised that you're doing a decent job. Much like managing stocks in a mutual fund, a stock manager cannot be 100% accurate or batting 1,000 in all of the projects. The same kinds of principles would apply when we're dealing with a large building stock. So I think in essence, you're stuck here trying to split hairs when in fact the problem is quite large, and we know that it's quite large. So I would suggest you do find ways. Option one is clearly a reasonable approach from our standpoint. We recommended that informally. I believe it was option two about 2 years ago, if my recommendations are correct. And that recommendation was not pursued at the time. But clearly option one now is something that we've identified in the past as a reasonable approach. Option three, unfortunately, opens you up to all sorts of variables, and given the time constraints, I'm not sure you have time to deal with option three without a lot more specificity and study. So that's essentially where we're at. If you want a summary of how we arrived at the category of vulnerable building types, we did look at the relative risks of Category 2 buildings, and we parsed out the ones that are substantially at greater risk. And granted, that too is subject to all sorts of simplifications, and quite often many buildings don't fit some of these categories. So it is unfortunately an imperfect approach as well, but it's better than nothing. So some form of lowering your seismic hazard threshold, such as in option one, still to us appears to be your best alternative.
What is your thought on the proposed solution of if you don't meet those criteria and you have an engineer's report that says it's an imminent, that it isn't a threat, that it be considered?
Well, I suspect that if you open up the floodgates, you will be opened up to criticism as to whether or not you're really addressing the most vulnerable building types. That's the only risk that you face. So you could actually have buildings that are in low to moderate seismic zones where an engineer happens to write a report and they happen to submit it. So without any threshold, you may end up having to retrofit buildings that in hindsight are going to be criticized as really not being that risky. They may very well be theoretically collapse risks in their particular area, but relatively speaking, there may be far more buildings elsewhere that are at much greater risk.
But if an engineer tells you that it's not safe right now for students to be in that house, in that
we have
in that building,
potentially thousands of buildings in that area.
And you agree with that. I mean,
Right.
You'd have to agree with it.
I'd say, in essence, you do have to face this anyways. And I think this fear of having a waiting list is something we don't quite understand. We do have a waiting list, so why don't we just get on with it, set a high threshold, and acknowledge that you will have a waiting list, and dole out the money on a first-come, first-served basis, given that lower threshold.
Can I just ask then, when you addressed this in the 80s with the state buildings,
Mm-hmm.
so you created the list,
Right.
in essence, and you
We could
funded
provide the list
and you
to your staff if
funded
you'd like
down
it.
it. We don't have a list, really. Correct, Dave? We don't really have a list. We have the AB 300 projects, but we don't have a list of by risk.
We actually, what we have that we've been working on with the current program criteria, the 1.68 and the Category 2 buildings that have been identified, we have a list that was eventually, it was created from looking at the AB 300, templating on those criteria, the spectral acceleration zone and the building types. And that's where that list of 48 came from. That was the genesis of it.
So,
Beyond that, no, there is no other list beyond that.
But in our own
We're dealing with a
situation,
much smaller building stock at the time of only 1,300 buildings,
but in
whereas
our,
your building
in
stock
our
is much, much larger.
situation, our risk list is voluntary because we had some districts that chose not to participate in those structural evaluations.
Yes.
So we could have a situation where there may be one in a building in a school district that didn't participate in the evaluation that would be of higher risk category than another, potentially, because we haven't created an all-encompassing list with structural knowledge and funded down the risk factors.
Yeah, if I could put that into perspective, Board Member Moore, I think actually what we don't know about earthquakes, about half of our earthquakes in California occur on previously unknown faults. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the SA values anyways. And it's quite likely we'll have future earthquakes that also occur on previously unknown faults in areas that have relatively low SA values anyways. So given that uncertainty, I think it's best that you consider lowering the SA threshold and sticking with your current list of eligible building types and developing what, living with the risk of a waiting list and doling out the money as efficiently and quickly as you can.
I think it'd be wonderful if we had a waiting list. That's our problem. We have $180 million, and we have no waiting list, and we have a criteria that's set so that some of the schools that have the greatest need don't get funded. And the beauty of applying a program to state buildings is that basically you're overseeing all of them. So you can inspect those buildings, do the engineering, do whatever you need, and come up with a list. Now, theoretically, that should be happening within school districts, right? You've got school boards,
that
you
should
have
be good
superintendents,
practice.
You've got people in charge of their facilities, and they should be assessing the safety of those. Because I don't see where it's realistic for the state of California to go out and inspect every single school in this state.
Clearly not.
And do the engineering and figure out what needs to be done. So we rely on school districts to do that. And so the question becomes, I still get back, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, to the criteria. Because clearly, if the criteria worked, we wouldn't be here talking. So the criteria is not working. So the question in my mind is, do we need an alternative criteria? And if I'm on the school board, and I've had this happen to me on more than just the San Juan High Gym, and I have an engineer that says, you've got a problem, and I ask that engineer, is it safe to house kids? And that engineer tells me no, or I wouldn't house my kids there, whatever, and I've got to close that building. I've got a problem. If you agree with me at the state that yes, the engineer's report is correct and you shouldn't be housing kids, I don't understand why that, and you're going to use maybe some of these criteria you have in terms of type of construction or anything else. I'm still beyond words in terms of why
I'd say the only impediment is the most vulnerable criteria that you have in statute right now as to whether you'd actually be able to meet that threshold.
But the question, if we want to wait for the most vulnerable, when you take a look at that whole AB 300 list, we'll have your problem. Where you've got a high-rise building that needs some retrofitting, but until you can replace the bike, whatever it is, the bike storage place at Berkeley, you can't do anything. So I don't know if we could ever absolutely guarantee that we're replacing or fixing the most vulnerable school first, because we might not know that, and we might not know that for another decade. But in the meantime, we have schools that have need, that aren't safe to house kids, where we should be contributing it. Now, some of these problems, we can discuss more. You've got a situation where, if the district doesn't have 50% of the funding and that's the program, we've got to make some decisions there. But if this program worked the way you're describing, we wouldn't be here, trying to figure out how to get the money out to schools.
If I could offer a suggestion, if that's all right with the board, a happy medium might be to direct the division of the state architect to reconvene its expert committee. We had several commissioners and other experts around the state to advise them, and ask them to come back to you with a lower threshold that would still be considered highly seismically active regions and collapse risk buildings in those regions. And anything within that category could be deemed as part of a large group of buildings that would otherwise be considered most vulnerable. And then you would have that discretion, and then dole out the money on a first-come, first-served basis for all those buildings that might meet that lower threshold. It could be 1.2G or 1G. We would have to have that kind of debate, I think, for you to allow to do that. And that would eliminate this fear of a school district in trying to do their best, coming in with a school that really is in a moderate to low seismic area. They're concerned about it, but clearly their risk is far lower than perhaps
unless
should be
I'm
eligible.
mistaken, with the material we've been given for the last meeting in this, the engineers can't come up with a rock solid criteria. In other words, they can't tell us, right? They can't tell us that if you have a lower number that means the district is an imminent threat.
Right.
are more vulnerable. So if we can't do that, it seems to me we're going to study this thing to death, and the money's going to be still sitting in the bank, and there are going to be school districts where engineers agree that we have classrooms or buildings that need to be replaced.
The analogy with state-owned buildings, we basically advise the state that the top third on the list is really the area where you should target investments. And any of those buildings within the top third is more than.
But with the state-owned buildings, you have a list. We will never have that list because we're relying on 1,000 school districts to do the
We do
engineering.
have a way of segregating the buildings by geotagging and telling you which buildings are in the top third area of seismicity in California. We can do that within minutes.
You know, one of the things that's crossed my mind, and I'm going to go way out on this, we have the freedom, perhaps, to maintain faith with what the voters asked and the statute, which says we must address the most vulnerable first, by regulation stating that we define most vulnerable to mean any time an engineer makes a finding that a building is unsafe for students or faculty, so long as, and then maybe put some standards in. And I get back to standards because I was interested in tickling out of you, if I could. You were apparently, not maybe personally, but Seismic Safety Commission apparently met with OPSC staff and talked about this incremental improvement approach.
Yeah, we met last week.
What were you thinking would be the standards in the incremental approach? It appealed to me because you were perhaps getting at more at-risk schools. You were doing it in a surgical, strategic way. You were doing it perhaps in the summer, so you're not facing some of these other interim housing and other issues. What standards were you thinking in this concept?
Well, DSA could also speak to this perhaps better than I, but I'll try to suggest that there is some recently made amendments to state regulations that allow for voluntary seismic retrofits that are incremental, as long as you don't make the building any more unsafe than it was before. That leaves much more discretion and flexibility to the individual school districts and their design professionals to design partial retrofits for buildings that are only going to incrementally address portions of the vulnerability. The only downside of that is you may not necessarily be reaching a defined performance objective for that building. There may be other parts of the building that could still pose risks, nevertheless.
You could do this incremental approach, getting after what ideally is the most salient thing, but in a horrible catastrophe, the building could still collapse because you haven't done everything you need to do.
From OPSC staff standpoint and the SAB standpoint, I believe there are ways of tailoring your constraints such that you strongly encourage that approach by school districts.
Couldn't you do an incremental approach where you meet the engineering standards to make a building safe, but you're not necessarily going through and doing all the ADA, all the other work that has
statutory changes, I believe.
So you could, he was saying that the building would be safe, but you.
We also have federal laws that restrict us on disabled access, so I'm not sure we can go that entire route. But there are projects that involve partial retrofits that won't necessarily trigger a lot of fire and life safety and disabled access. And I think there can be ways that the State Allocation Board and OPSC staff can encourage that approach, and perhaps some education is necessary as well, because unfortunately there are a lot of school districts that feel it's an all-or-nothing venture, and they're looking at these as largely replacement projects in many respects, and perhaps a more surgical approach is prudent given the limited availability of funds.
Well, I think there may be some merit there. I'm going to poll the committee. We're after 5 o'clock. I'm trying to be respectful of what commitments you all may have after hours. I'm willing to go until at least 5:30, but I want to find out what your parameters and constraints are. Okay to 5:30? Do we have anybody in the audience, let me ask Mr. Smoot, who has a time constraint, a plane to catch that would need to go right now? Otherwise, we'll simply take you in order. Lyle, you're up.
Thank you. Lyle Smoot, Los Angeles Unified School District. and I want to commend you for this discussion today. We do not believe or agree, maybe is the proper term, that the most vulnerable building is the one that's in the worst ground shaking area. We believe the most vulnerable building is the one that's going to fall down in an earthquake that can happen in that area based on the ground shaking of that area. So the problem with the current program, and the reason it doesn't work, is that you can't create that funnel based on funding availability and expect it to work. You have to base it on what's the problem and how do you address the problem. So we would like to see you take off the ground shaking and just based it on a structural engineer's analysis, and of course the structural engineer has to conclude that it's going to have a problem, a fall down problem, based on the earthquake shaking potential of that area, and as in the current program, DSA has to concur that the structural analysis is a reasonable one that actually fits the bill. So we'd like to see that happen. We commend you for that conversation. Just quickly, obviously we don't like the recommendation that is actually a note here saying if you don't file in some period of time, you can't file. We don't think that's a reasonable thing for all kinds of reasons that you've already covered. We'd like to see the money stay in the current program. Don't have any major objection if you want to transfer it over to the other one. We'd just like to see a separate seismic mitigation program that addresses these specific issues. And putting it in the other one is okay as long as you still maintain that integrity of a seismic safety or seismic mitigation program. So I just want to thank you for that.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
How did Los Angeles determine its most vulnerable buildings?
I'm sorry?
How did Los Angeles Unified determine its most vulnerable buildings?
Well, most vulnerable, if you define most vulnerable as being at risk of falling down, then I think you have the ability to do that. Now, I don't know about this Category 2 stuff, but I don't remember anything in the law or any place that says it has to be in a 1.68 or a 1.7 or any other shaking. It just has to be at risk of falling down. And if that's what you just come out and say, the building has to be at risk of falling down, there you are. If it's at risk, it's at risk. And that's the most vulnerable, pardon me for putting it this way, but a student that gets hurt in a building of a 1.68 or a student that gets hurt in a building of 1.25, they're both hurt. And I don't think you're going to be able to, as a school district, stand there and say, well, you shouldn't have got hurt in that building.
Maybe you don't know, Lyle, but I'm aware that Los Angeles has a list of their seismic buildings, and that they would address, because they indicated to me that only one of their buildings qualified under the current program. So I was just curious, and you weren't prepared. I was just curious how they created their list.
How many would we have on the list?
How Los Angeles created its list of buildings that they're working down concerning seismic issues.
What criteria did LAUSD use to establish your most vulnerable list? You apparently have a list in some rank order. How was that determined?
Thank you for interpreting.
Pretty much exactly. I'm sorry, Kathleen. I just can't. For some reason, your voice is in that range where I can't hear it. Oh boy, that was dangerous, wasn't it? The criteria we use is exactly what I just said. If we have reason to believe that there is a problem with it, and we send a structural engineer out to look at it, and he said, hey, this is a problem, and for these reasons in this zone, that's how we put them on our list, and that's how we start addressing them. And we don't have knowledge of, I'm not saying they aren't there, but we don't have knowledge of vast numbers of buildings. We do know of several buildings that if that was the criteria, we could probably qualify for several buildings.
Seeing no other questions, do we have any other member of the audience? Thank you, Mr. Smoot. Any other member of the audience who wishes to inform, enlighten, and help? Seismic Safety Commission is back. I love this. Yes, please, for the record.
If I could help, the Commission has provided some funds to OPSC, and we've provided a template through the use of those funds that uses a national standard for the seismic evaluation of buildings. And I believe that's a well-recognized approach for establishing whether buildings are, in fact, at risk of collapse. It's based on a national standard called the American Society of Civil Engineers 31, the national standard for the seismic evaluation of buildings.
Does it use, does it use criteria like most vulnerable, imminent threat? What terms does it use to establish that ranking?
If the building does not meet a life safety performance objective, it's considered not to comply with that standard.
Is embedded in that a ground shaking
Yes.
Number?
Correct.
What is the
and
number?
We now have a uniform template that can be applied to all schools, and we've tried it out on 30-some-odd schools.
It's
and
1.68.
So you
right now,
use the
current
number
criteria.
that we had established as a board, but
Frankly, you could use any number that
But-
the board wishes
In a
to
new number,
establish
sure.
and run with that template.
what are other things in the template besides seismic? I'm sorry.
There are a lot of qualitative and judgmental considerations, such as whether parts of buildings are connected to each other, whether there are load paths in the building that will resist earthquakes. If there is not a load path, the building is considered to be at risk. And so engineers are required through this standard to evaluate all of those qualitative aspects that are not necessarily connected directly to a numerical value as in addition to the numerical values. So it's both a judgmental as well as a numerical approach in the seismic evaluation of existing buildings.
So, you know, my problem is I, as an SAB member, I don't want to pick a number because that number to me should be based on some kind of scientific data. And if the number they have is 1.68, that's fine. The question, but you're saying that that's not the only number. See, the problem is for us right now, that is the number that we've established is the number, you know, and is a hard criteria. So when you agreed with the engineers for Moronga schools that it wasn't safe to house students, did you use that criteria?
I was not involved personally.
Okay, DSA, okay.
could answer
Was
that question.
all right, was that criteria, was that criteria used?
If we could have Mr. Chip Howard-Smith address this question.
I can tell you Morongo did not meet the 1.68 threshold. I can
We
speak
know
to
that.
I know
And
that,
she's
but that's
asking-
my point is it didn't meet the threshold to qualify for seismic, so we funded it under the facilities hardship. But at the time when it was presented to us, DSA agreed that the school was unsafe. So I'd just like to know
What that criteria
what
was.
that criteria was.
That I think there were two events regarding DSA. The first event occurred where we actually did agree that the building was unsafe, and that was more or less a subjective concurrence based on the building code, not based on a seismic standard. The second step that occurred was we disagreed, and that's because, and I think the context wasn't the seismic program, it was the
It was that it met the code at the time it was constructed.
Yes. So,
Which, I mean, you're going to have probably, hopefully you've got all your buildings that met the code at the time they were constructed.
right. So, and that issue with Morongo wasn't a shaking concern, it was a faulting concern. And the reason that the current criteria is predicated on a shaking number, not a faulting issues, in working with CGS, they've indicated that strong shaking is by far and away the most dominant hazard, as opposed to faulting or landslide, liquefaction, tsunami, that strong shaking on an order of magnitude or 10 times more so than any other hazard is the dominant hazard to consider from a statewide perspective. So that's why the spectral acceleration criteria was used, as opposed to, say, location with regards to an earthquake fault. So it was just that simple. Now, as a matter of fact, for that particular case, they did sit on a hazard, was significant, but the program and the criteria were developed for a statewide application, noting the most prevalent hazard, not all of the hazards.
Right.
Right.
I think that's
Because
the point.
in a general sense, we're mixing concepts. I think risk represents vulnerability and hazard.
Yeah.
But we're using that term vulnerable or most vulnerable in the context of risk. But
Right.
risk is actually derived from both vulnerability, building system.
In my mind, and I will tell you when I go to the polls, is if I'm voting based on vulnerable, I'm thinking the school that is in danger of collapse. And
That's risk.
causing, well, right, but I mean, it's
Two different things.
It may be two different things, but I
Right.
I find it hard to believe that vulnerable doesn't tie to risk in that way. I mean, if
Risk is a function of vulnerability
Right.
and hazard, or shaking, faulting, so on. Right.
Thank you, Chip.
Okay.
The interesting thing I want to editorialize for a minute is, constraining as our program is, as little dollars as we've gotten now, the system worked for Moronga. They didn't initially get the response they wanted. They appealed to the board, and we granted the dollars. So there is a safety valve no matter what we do with this or other programs. It's called the appeal process. And a district has the right to say, wait a minute, and the board holds the ultimate card. So I just wanted to note that in this case, the system worked. Mr. Duffy, is this on point?
It is, hopefully, because I was going to make a recommendation to you. I think that Ms. Moore hit on something very important earlier, and I didn't comment on that, and that is the reservation of funds. If we reserve funds for critically level credit schools and for charter schools, it seems that this program would trump those kinds of issues, at least the charters at this point in time, because we're talking about the potential of at-risk buildings. And since you really don't have funds today, you have authority. Maybe taking into consideration those projects that are in the queue at this point in time, those that are identified by Mr. Zian, but maybe identifying, taking the idea that you have used so successfully with the priorities and funding. If you identified as a pilot $20 million in your authority to say, come in the door and we'll cover the cost of the structural engineer's report. We'll fuss with you over interim housing, but we'll give you interim housing if you actually need that. And we'll make sure that that we'll review all of the hardship issues that you may bring before the Mr. Zian or whoever it be. But that if you come in the door and you qualify, that you get first funding when we have funding in the fall, when we have a bond sale, or when we have funds that are recovered because districts do not access their up through the 18-month the funds that have been reserved for them. The point being that, going in the direction I think you were going, Ms. Buchanan, that if indeed a structural engineer identifies this building as at risk and that there's imminent danger there, the term that was utilized was, I think, imminent collapse, but I think what was used by the board in its discussion some time ago was imminent danger. So if there's imminent danger and there's a structural engineer's report that supports that, VSA confirms it, why not create a pilot that says, see if we can encourage districts with these kinds of projects to come in and allow them to have the interim housing structural engineer's report and the other things we just talked about. It seems to me that would be challenging, very much like you challenged with the priorities and funding. You would say, we're going to guarantee you that as soon as we have some funds, we'll give it to you if you take the risk to impugn your own buildings.
My only comment on that is I would like to see if we change the criteria, if we had districts that could come in under the 50% match, because I think that would maximize the number of buildings that we're addressing under the program. Because ultimately, my own goal is to fix as many buildings as possible. So the question in my mind is it the criteria or is it the funding? I mean, I started out talking about criteria and how we fund the money. I came around to saying, okay, it's criteria, it's what do we fund, and then it's in what program or, do we house or release the funding. And I wonder if we change the criteria to say, engineer, DSA concurrence based on whatever theirs, if that is going to result. Because if we gave $20 million and paid 100% of the cost, I think we would be oversubscribed by tenfold or whatever, because you'd have all kinds of districts. I don't know how you then pick and choose.
And I wasn't suggesting that you move away from 50-50 funding or 60-40 funding unless there was a significant fiscal issue with the district. Trying to go in the direction I think that Ms. Moore was going, and that is, if and the hardship statute basically says if you have a facility issue and you have no funds to meet that issue, that's the very first part of the hardship statute. If that indeed is something that needs to be looked at because of a seismic issue, I think then directing the OPSC to look at that is important to do. But in the main, what I was suggesting was guarantee funding to those projects that come in, give them that allowance or support the allowance for structural engineers report, and give them something for interim housing. And we'll do, Mr. Harvey, what you had asked. We will try to publicize and write to not only make sure that there's a difference between the seismic program and the AB 300 report, although that's going to be quite a challenge because this is now mushroomed to a large degree because of the press. But we would publicize, if indeed you would take this kind of action, we'd publicize that and say, come in the door. But I think the guarantee, as Ms. Moore was saying before, is significant. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We're getting close to 5:30. I'm going to suggest that we meet one more time. And let me list what I think we need from staff, and if you two would add to it. If I'm missing something, I'd appreciate it. Some of the dangling modifiers, if I can use that term, that we need to call out and then ultimately make a recommendation on are the question of if we have a set aside, do we want to do a reservation of funds? On interim housing, we need to go up or down on interim housing. On the question of match, we need some guidance. If we wanted to change the 50-50, do we need to do it legislatively, or is there another mechanism to do that? And I would ask that OPSC and seismic safety staff get together and take a stab at this concept that defines most vulnerable in a way that you have a structural engineer that makes some kind of initial finding of vulnerability, risk, unsafeness. You may want to recommend some standards if appropriate. DSA would have to concur in that finding. And again, if there are recommendations for what standards DSA should use, I think we would appreciate it. But given our conversation today, I think those were the major issues that were raised as concerns, and we haven't had time to give any committee recommendations on those. Would you add anything to that list or do a subset of anything thereon?
You covered everything that we've discussed that I'm aware.
Then we will ask if staff understands it. I see some finger waving over here, and again, we would respectfully ask that you find a time before the May board meeting that we might meet. I will say by disclosure, if the subcommittee wishes to meet in my absence, because that's the only time you can meet, I think you should. I've got a long-standing family reunion commitment. Will take me out of state from May 4th to the 14th. So if we could do something after the 14th that works, that would be fine. But if you need to do it before then, 2 people create a quorum, and I would trust my colleagues to wrestle with these issues, and I would voice my concerns and vote at the full board meeting. But you had your hand.
Just one point. Set aside reservations of funds and bond authority. Is that where you were going at, Kathleen? I know Tom was speaking of funds as relation to a bond sale.
I was more conceptual about bond authority.
Okay.
I think he was
yes.
speaking to cash. I was speaking to.
Okay. I just wanted that point cleared up.
Yeah. Any other issues for staff seeking clarification before we adjourn this meeting? I guess I should ask one last time, is there anything anyone wants to say that has not been on this agenda? We usually have a comment public comment period? Seeing none, thank you for your participation. Until next time, we're adjourned.